exotic, indescribable. Welcome to another episode of Erik Wait Whiskey Studies, and in this video I'm going to do a review of the Glendalough 13-year-old Irish whiskey finished in Mizunara cask. This is an absolutely superb whiskey, but before I get into it, here are my notes on this producer, Mizunara oak, and this whiskey. The Glendalough Distillery was founded by 5 friends with a mutual love of Irish whiskey and steeped in the lore and legend of Ireland. The distillery name Glendalough is Gaelic for the Glen of Two Lakes. The distillery is located in the narrow glacial valley in the Wicklow Mountains, about an hour or so south of Dublin. The County Wicklow Valley is known as the Garden of Ireland and is among the most visited scenic attractions in the country. The distillery produces a range of spirits, including a series of seasonal gins that reflect the unique mix of botanicals that are foraged during each of the 4 seasons. These are bottled as spring, summer, autumn, and winter gins. They also make a potsheen, a traditional Irish moonshine that is considered the first distillate produced in Ireland and the father of Irish whiskey. Glendalough Distillery currently produces 3 different whiskeys: a grain whiskey, a 7-year single malt, and a 13-year single malt. The grain whiskey is distilled in a continuous still, while the single malts are distilled in a pot still. All 3 whiskeys are aged in a variety of casks. These range from traditional American ex-bourbon barrels to Oloroso sherry butts to barrels that previously housed Dublin Porter, a rich dark beer. They also produce whiskey using rare Japanese oak Mizunara barrels and virgin Irish oak barrels. The virgin Irish oak barrels come from trees in the oak forest that surrounds the distillery. There are 3 challenges to aging whiskey in Mizunara oak. The first, Mizunara oak has a much higher moisture content than the Quercus family of oak, making it a very challenging wood to make whiskey barrels. Second, Mizunara trees are not manicured to grow straight like the groomed forests in Europe and the USA. Consequently, it takes almost 200 years to have sufficient wood quality to be made into casks. Third, like many exotic forms of wood from hot climates around the world, Mizunara is very porous and is prone to leaking. All of these factors make Mizunara barrel production prohibitively expensive and rare. The Japanese Mizunara oak comes from Hokkaido, the most rugged and northern island of Japan. The Glendalough 13-year-old Mizunara finished single malt Irish whiskey is aged for 13 years in ex-bourbon barrels, then a shorter run in Mizunara oak puncheons. It's bottled at 46% alcohol by volume and sells for anywhere between $80 and $110 in the United States. So Mizunara oak, in terms of the flavors and aromas it provides in a whiskey, is very, very, very aggressive. It's like a very intense spice, and so producers, when they're using Mizunara oak, have to be very judicious. They can't just, slap a Mizunara on a whiskey, because it will completely take over and overrun a palate. In fact, I've had a Japanese whiskey that was aged in 100% Mizunara oak, don't know how long, and it was like too much. It was too much. It was a good whiskey to then take and blend with other whiskeys to add a little accent to another whiskey, but on its own, it's really, really aggressive. So it's a fantastic oak, has a really, really unique characteristics. As I said, practically indescribable because there's nothing else like it. But you have to be very, very careful, which is why 13 years, but an undefined amount of time in the Mizunara, because it's not going to take a whole lot of time in a Mizunara oak cask to give it a lot of flavor. Probably less than a year, I would say probably only a few months, and yet it has a huge impact on this whiskey. Now, color-wise, sort of a golden copper color on the nose, and this is where it gets really, really challenging. So if I were to describe in a bourbon and I said, oh, it's got corn, candy corn. It's got caramels. It's got butterscotch. It's got butter. It's got vanilla. It's got baking spices. You would know what I'm talking about. There are these other things you have tasted and smelled that are near exact representations of what's actually in the bourbon, right? Same thing with wines. You have a Sauvignon Blanc. You've got grapefruit and perhaps a little tropical character, depending on where the grapes are from. You have maybe a little grassy note, right? These are classic descriptors for a Sauvignon Blanc wine. Well, what does Mizunara oak? If you've never smelled it or tasted it, what does it smell and taste like? You're going to find it surprising. Mizunara smells and tastes like Mizunara. There really isn't anything outside of it that smells and tastes like Mizunara. So whatever descriptors anyone uses for a Mizunara oak are approximations. They're not going to be as exact or accurate or precise as other descriptors might be of a whiskey. So try to get into the ballpark. It reminds me of this, kind of reminds me of that, but nothing's going to be exact. So in terms of the fruit characteristics, I get apples and pears, but also quince. If you've never had quince, if you were to Google images, it looks like a pear, but you can't eat it like a pear because it's very, 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 very hard. The only way you're going to eat a quince is if you're going to cook it, perhaps bake it. So most of the times that I've had quince, it's either been made into a preserve or some jam or jelly, or it's been baked. So this sort of reminds me of quince that's been baked, and then they put like a glaze on, a sugary glaze, and then add some spices. Now, you could have pepper spice, you could have baking spices like cinnamon, and all these various spices that you might have in your cupboard aren't exactly like this. And so it's hard to look into my spice rack and go, okay, it's like this one, it's like this one, it's like this one. Really, really hard. But I'm going to try. So there is an approximation, a ginger note, a cinnamon note. But it really starts to remind me more of if you ever go into a candle shop or an incense shop and you walk in, there's very perfuming, there's sort of intense incense burning, or if you happen to visit a Buddhist temple in which they are burning incense, or if you were perhaps raised in the Catholic Church and they were burning incense, you know, you're sort of approximating getting into that neighborhood. There is a wood character, but it's not like if you ever took a wood shop, right, or you're planing wood or you're building a fence or anything like that. It's not like the woods that you're going to be familiar with. It's more like a sandalwood. So you have your exotic woods, manzanilla. You have, say, like cedar. Like you have something you store a humidor that you put your cigars in, or like my mom had a cedar chest. You know, a cedar keeps moths away, so you put cedar perhaps in your closet to keep moths off your clothes. Put these little cedar balls, you hang them in the closet on hangers to keep the moths away. There's something similar to that going on as well. Or mesquite, like a Texas mesquite. Now, I'm talking in terms of a category of unique aromas of wood. Manzanilla, mesquite, cedar. This would be in those sort of that ballpark figure of those sort of characteristics, but not exact. There's just a whiff of smoke, but I don't think it's from necessarily anything being charred. It just reminds you of smoke. But again, it's going to be like a burning incense or a very, very exotic wood that's been burned. There is some vanilla in there. There's some slight citrus notes as well. All right, on the palate. Wow. If this is a whiskey you had for the first time, you've never had Mizunara, this is really, really going to go, you're just going to go, whoa, I've never had anything like that. Obviously, been a Japanese oak, you're going to run into Mizunara more in Japanese whiskeys. I've had a number of different Japanese whiskeys aged in Mizunara for some amount of time. This beats them all. This beats them all. And I've had Japanese whiskeys that now, because of the way the Japanese whiskey market is going, are going for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars. That spent time in Mizunara, and this totally blows them all away. So if you want to experience Mizunara without, spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars, you actually got to go to Ireland to get a bottle to experience probably the greatness that Mizunara can provide to whiskey, because I think this beats every Japanese whiskey I've ever tasted with Mizunara in it. So on the palate, the nose is confirmed, but again, it's very, very difficult to describe. There is a sort of baked, glazed quince. There's some tropical notes, some apples, some pears, perhaps a little bit of peach. But really what is, say, dominating the profile is going to be these really, really unique spices. And as I'm talking now, I can still taste them. This probably has the longest finish of any whiskey I have ever had. You can literally take a sip and don't touch it again for another half an hour, and you're still tasting it. I've actually tested this. I was watching television. I had a glass of this off to the side. I took a sip at the beginning of a show and just sat there. And at the end of the half-hour show, I could still taste this whiskey. That spice character really, really, really lingers. All right, so on the palate, you're very, very exotic, unique, almost indescribable spice notes. The cinnamon there, ginger is probably a close approximation, and Asian spice is probably in there. Nutmeg, cardamom, just everything on your spice rack. That's probably closest thing. Take everything on your spice rack and blend it all together, and maybe you might get something similar to this, because it's just so complex. Now, the awesome thing about this whiskey is, as much as the exotic and very just unique characteristics of the Mizunara cask on this is, they haven't overdone it. The blending has been very, really, very, very well done. It is really well balanced between the fruit character and the spice. The spice isn't overwhelming. I've also had some Japanese whiskey that had Mizunara oak, and you had to search for it. They barely put anything. I don't know. They barely had any Mizunara oak on it, and I was sort of disappointed with them. Right? These really, really cheap, very, very, very young, newly released Japanese whiskeys. Really, really disappointing. This is really well balanced. I think it's well blended. I think it has just an absolutely superb evolution from the front to the middle and to the finish. The finish is absolutely unbelievable. This is a spectacular whiskey. Now, before I give you a point score, but I want to say this. It's also a whiskey, because of its intensity and flavor, and the uniqueness of flavor is, I'm going to have to be in the mood for it. I'm going to have to be, I'm really, really in the mood for this whiskey. So this is a bottle I'm going to want to have around for when I'm in the mood. It's maybe a special occasion whiskey. So I find one of the things is after having a meal, because of the intensity and the layers of the flavor, it can also be a palate cleanser to whatever you're eating before, and it'll completely override anything you were previously eating in terms of what you're tasting. So it works really well as an after dinner whiskey in which you're in the mood for something very, 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 very spicy and exotic. It's something I'm going to be in the mood for. I don't eat a whole lot of curry or in East Indian food, but sometimes I'm really in the mood for curry and some Indian food, and so I'll go get it, right? It's sort of, for me personally, it's sort of that occasion of a whiskey in which I'm going to reach for this bottle. But now, in terms of a score, 90, I'm going to go with 95 points. 95 points. I think this is an absolutely superb whiskey. Potentially one among my top 10 for this year. An absolutely superb whiskey. It's delicate. It's got power. It's got strength. It's got layers of flavor. It's got the complexity. It's got the length of finish. Really, really, really impressive whiskey. And yet I still think, even though you got to hunt around for it, sometimes retail you can find it for 90. If you got to ship it, like I've had to, and you start paying for post and all that kind of stuff, you start getting $120, $130. You start getting those price range, but still, for something of this high quality, and I think it's an excellent buy. I want to highly, 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 highly recommend buying a bottle. Alrighty, that's it. If you are liking my videos, you like watching my videos, but you've not yet subscribed, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe, ring the bell to be notified when I go live or post a new video. And if you are a member of my Patreons, I want to thank you very much for supporting this work. All right, until next time, cheers.